On a spring morning in Prague, May 23, 1618, two Catholic imperial governors stood at a third-floor window of Hardchony Castle, arguing with an angry mob of Protestant nobles. The argument had been building for months, for years really, ever since the old emperor had died, and the new one, Ferdinand II, had begun dismantling the fragile religious peace that had held Bohemia together. The Protestant nobles accused the governors of violating the Letter of Majesty, the sacred document that guaranteed religious freedom. The governors insisted they were merely following the emperor's orders. Voices rose, tempers flared, and then someone made a decision that would cost 8 million lives. Count Thurn grabbed Governor Yaroslav Martinich. Other nobles seized Wilhelm Slavata and his secretary, Philip Fabricius. They dragged all three men to the tall Gothic windows overlooking the castle moat. The governors protested, struggled, pleaded. It made no difference. The Protestant nobles threw them out the window. 70 feet down, the three men tumbled through the air and landed with a wet thud in a pile of horse manure that had accumulated below the castle walls. Incredibly, miraculously, all three survived. The Catholics called it divine intervention. The Virgin Mary herself spread her cloak to save them, proclaimed the Jesuits. The Protestants laughed it off. Soft shit makes a soft landing, they said. Nobody laughed for long. Within days, Bohemia was in full revolt. Within months, armies were marching. Within a year, what had begun as a local dispute about church property would metastasize into the most devastating conflict Europe had ever known, a war that would rage for 30 years, consume an entire generation, depopulate regions by half or more, and ultimately prove that when men invoke God's name while reaching for swords, it is rarely God they truly serve. This is the story of how that happened, not a story of heroes and villains, but of how ordinary human ambitions for power, for security, for wealth, for glory, dressed themselves in the language of heaven and created something very much like hell on earth. Nobody laughed for long. Within days, Bohemia was in full revolt. Within months, armies were marching. Within a year, what had begun as a local dispute about church property would metastasize into the most devastating conflict Europe had ever known, a war that would rage for 30 years, consume an entire generation, depopulate regions by half or more, and ultimately prove that when men invoke God's name while reaching for swords, it is rarely God they truly serve. This is the story of how that happened, not a story of heroes and villains, but of how ordinary human ambitions for power, for security, for wealth, for glory, dressed themselves in the language of heaven and created something very much like hell on earth.
The Bohemian Gamble, 1618 to 1621. The Gathering Storm. Bohemia in 1618 was one of the richest territories in Europe. Its capital, Prague, was a jewel of Renaissance culture where astronomers calculated the movements of planets, alchemists searched for the philosopher's stone, and scholars from across the continent gathered in libraries filled with knowledge. The city's spires reached toward heaven. Its universities buzzed with debate. Its markets overflowed with goods from Venice, Vienna, and beyond. It was also a powder keg. The Holy Roman Empire, that vast and barely coherent collection of hundreds of territories stretching across Central Europe, had been religiously divided since Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to a church door a century earlier. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 had established an uneasy truce. Each prince could determine whether his territory would be Catholic or Protestant, and his subjects had to follow or leave. But Bohemia was different. Here, Protestants and Catholics had learned to coexist, more or less. The Bohemian nobility was overwhelmingly Protestant, followers of Jan Hus, the reformer who'd been burned at the stake 2 centuries before Luther was born. But their king was a Habsburg, and the Habsburgs were the champions of Catholic Europe. Emperor Rudolf II, who ruled until 1612, had been eccentric and reclusive, but tolerant. He cared more about his art collection and his alchemical experiments than about forcing his subjects into religious conformity. In 1609, he had even granted the Letter of Majesty, officially guaranteeing religious freedom to Bohemian Protestants. But Rudolf was gone now, replaced first by his brother Matthias, and then in 1617 by his cousin Ferdinand. And Ferdinand II was a very different kind of man. Educated by Jesuits, Ferdinand believed with absolute certainty that God had called him to restore the true faith. Religious tolerance, to his mind, was not a virtue, but a weakness, a betrayal of divine truth. He'd already demonstrated his methods in his own hereditary lands of Styria, where he'd given Protestants a simple choice: convert to Catholicism or leave. Thousands had chosen exile. Now Ferdinand was king of Bohemia, and the Bohemian Protestants watched with growing alarm as he began appointing Catholics to key positions, closing Protestant churches, and making it clear that the Letter of Majesty was, in his view, a mistake to be corrected. The Protestants protested. Ferdinand ignored them. They petitioned. He dismissed their grievances. They assembled in Prague to present their demands in person. That's when someone decided to throw his representatives out a window. The Revolution. The Defenestration of Prague, for that's what history would call it, using the same term applied to a similar incident 200 years earlier, was simultaneously ridiculous and deadly serious. Ridiculous because 3 grown men landed in horseshit and survived to tell the tale. Deadly serious because it was an act of open rebellion against the Holy Roman Emperor, and everyone knew what came next. The Bohemian estates, the assembly of nobles who technically elected their king, moved quickly. They declared Ferdinand deposed, raised an army, and began looking for a new king who would defend Protestant rights. They found him in Frederick V, the young Elector Palatine from the Rhineland. Frederick was Calvinist, well-connected, his father-in-law was King James I of England, and ambitious enough to accept a crown even when it came with an emperor's wrath attached. In November 1619, Frederick and his English wife Elizabeth arrived in Prague to tremendous celebration. The Protestants had their champion. The Letter of Majesty would be preserved, religious freedom was secure. It lasted exactly a year. The Battle of White Mountain. Ferdinand II did not accept his deposition quietly. He called upon his Catholic allies, Spain, Bavaria, Saxony, whose Lutheran duke chose imperial loyalty over Protestant solidarity, and assembled an army. By autumn 1620, their forces were marching on Prague. Frederick's army, a mixed force of Bohemian and mercenary troops, met them on White Mountain just outside the city on November 8, 1620. The battle lasted 2 hours. The Protestant forces, poorly coordinated and demoralized by the approach of the professional imperial army, broke and ran almost immediately. 4,000 were killed. The rest scattered into the countryside or fled into Prague. By nightfall, it was over. Frederick and Elizabeth, the Winter King and Queen who'd ruled barely a season, fled the city in the middle of the night, leaving behind their crown jewels, their possessions, and their dignity. They would spend the rest of their lives in exile, wandering from court to court, living on the charity of relatives and the fading hope of restoration. Behind them, Prague prepared for retribution. The blood reckoning. Ferdinand's victory was total. His revenge was calculated. 27 Protestant leaders, nobles, knights, burghers were arrested and charged with high treason. Their trial was a formality. The verdict was predetermined. On June 21, 2021, they were brought to Old Town Square in the heart of Prague for public execution. The square filled with people, forced to watch what happened to traitors. The executioner, Jan Midlar, worked methodically through the list. 12 were beheaded, 15 were hanged. All 27 died that day while priests offered them final opportunities to convert to Catholicism and save their souls, if not their lives. One of those executed was Jan Gesenius, a physician and scholar who'd once been rector of Charles University. Gesenius had given an anatomical lecture years before, publicly dissecting a corpse to demonstrate the workings of the human body. He'd also spoken publicly against Ferdinand's policies. For this, the executioners first cut out his tongue, then beheaded him, then quartered his body. The pieces were displayed on the city gates as a warning. But the executions were only the beginning. In the months that followed, Ferdinand systematically dismantled Protestant Bohemia. 80% of Protestant noble estates were confiscated and redistributed to Catholic loyalists. Protestant churches were closed or converted. Protestant schools were shut down. Protestant books were burned in public ceremonies while priests blessed the flames. Tens of thousands of Protestants, scholars, merchants, artisans, farmers, chose exile over conversion. They walked out of Bohemia tearing what they could, leaving behind homes their families had occupied for generations. Among them was Jan Amos Comenius, a Protestant minister and educator who would spend the rest of his life wandering Europe writing treatises on education and dreaming of the homeland he would never see again. Bohemia, once the most tolerant and cultured land in Central Europe, became a byword for Catholic triumph and Protestant suffering. And the war was only beginning.
Internationalization, 1625 to 1630. The Danish intervention. Protestant Europe watched what happened in Bohemia with horror and calculation. If Ferdinand could crush the Protestants there, where would he stop? The Edict of Restitution, issued in 1629, seemed to confirm their worst fears. It demanded that all church property seized by Protestants since 1552 be returned to Catholic control, a decree that would strip hundreds of Protestant territories of land and wealth. Christian IV of Denmark decided to act. The Danish king was Lutheran, ambitious, and concerned about Habsburg power creeping toward his borders. In 1625, backed by money from England and the Netherlands, he marched his army into northern Germany. He also faced two of the most formidable military commanders of the age. Count Tilly, the Bavarian general, was a professional soldier who had spent his entire adult life in war. Disciplined, methodical, and utterly loyal to the Catholic cause, Tilly commanded armies with ruthless efficiency. But it was the other commander, Albrecht von Wallenstein, who would prove the more fascinating and dangerous. The rise of Wallenstein. Wallenstein was a Bohemian nobleman who had converted from Protestantism to Catholicism, not out of conviction, but opportunity. He recognized which way the wind was blowing and adjusted his beliefs accordingly. When the Protestant estates were confiscated after White Mountain, Wallenstein was there to buy them at bargain prices. Within a few years, he was one of the richest men in Bohemia. In 1625, he approached Emperor Ferdinand with an extraordinary offer. "Give me permission," Wallenstein said, "and I will raise an army of 50,000 men at no cost to the imperial treasury." How? By making war pay for itself. His army would feed itself by requisitioning supplies from the territories it passed through, friend or foe. It would pay its soldiers with plunder. It would sustain itself through systematic extraction of everything of value from the lands it occupied. Ferdinand, desperately in need of military force and desperately short of money, agreed. Wallenstein proved as good as his word. Within months, he had assembled a massive army through a combination of recruitment, conscription, and sheer willpower. His troops marched into northern Germany and, working with Tilly's forces, crushed the Danish armies in a series of battles. By 1629, Christian IV had been driven back to Denmark and forced to sign a peace treaty. He withdrew from the war, his ambitions shattered, his treasury depleted. But the cost of Wallenstein's success was becoming apparent. His army, living off the land, devastated everything in its path. Peasants saw their harvests seized. Towns saw their storehouses emptied.
Even Catholic territories that had welcomed the imperial forces at first soon learned to dread their arrival. Better the enemy should march through than a friend, went the bitter saying of the time, because the enemy might just pass through and leave. A friendly army would stay, and staying meant slowly bleeding the territory dry. Wallenstein himself grew increasingly powerful and increasingly dangerous. His army was loyal to him personally, not to the emperor. He governed his territories like an independent prince. He negotiated with foreign powers on his own authority. He began to seem less like the emperor's servant and more like a rival. In 1630, under pressure from the German Catholic princes who feared Wallenstein's power as much as they appreciated his victories, Ferdinand reluctantly dismissed his general. It would prove to be a terrible mistake, because just as Wallenstein was being forced into retirement, a new player was entering the war, one who would change everything.
The Lion from the North, 1630 to 1632. Gustavus Adolphus lands. In July 1630, Swedish King Gustavus Adolphus landed on the coast of Pomerania with an army of 13,000 men. He came, he proclaimed, to save German Protestantism from Catholic tyranny. He came as God's instrument of justice. He came as the Lion of the North, the champion of the true faith. He also came because Sweden had clear strategic interests in controlling the Baltic coast, because his advisers saw opportunity in German chaos, and because a successful military campaign in Germany would make Sweden the dominant power in Northern Europe. Religious conviction and political calculation marched together off those ships, and contemporaries disagreed then, as historians disagree now, about which motive mattered more. Perhaps Gustavus Adolphus himself couldn't have separated them. Perhaps that's the point. What was undeniable was his military genius. Gustavus Adolphus had reformed the Swedish army into the most effective fighting force in Europe. His infantry used lighter, more mobile formations. His artillery was standardized and quick-firing. His cavalry charged with disciplined ferocity. And his combined arms tactics, integrating infantry, cavalry, and artillery in coordinated assaults, revolutionized warfare. He also had money, from an unexpected source. Cardinal Richelieu, the chief minister of Catholic France, opened negotiations with Protestant Sweden in 1631. The result was the Treaty of Bärwalda, in which France agreed to pay Sweden substantial subsidies to continue fighting the Habsburgs. Let that sink in. Catholic France, governed by a cardinal of the Church, agreed to fund Protestant Sweden's war against Catholic Austria and Spain. Richelieu's logic was coldly political. The Habsburg dynasty ruled both Austria and Spain, creating a vast arc of power that encircled France. If the Habsburgs won in Germany, French security would be threatened. Therefore, the Habsburgs must be weakened, regardless of religion. When critics pointed out the awkwardness of a Catholic power supporting Protestants against fellow Catholics, Richelieu reportedly replied, "In matters of state, one must consider the interests of the state." The mask was slipping, or perhaps it had never really been on. The sack of Magdeburg. Before Gustavus could fully deploy his forces, tragedy struck, or rather, catastrophe was unleashed. Magdeburg, a wealthy Protestant city in central Germany, had allied with Sweden and fortified itself against imperial attack. In the spring of 1631, Tilly's Catholic army laid siege to the city, demanding its surrender. The city refused. The siege tightened.
Gustavus marched to relieve the city, but he was delayed by political negotiations with German Protestant princes who feared Swedish power almost as much as they feared Habsburg victory. On May 20th, 1631, Tilly's forces stormed the city. What happened next shocked all of Europe. The imperial soldiers, many of them mercenaries who hadn't been paid in months, poured into Magdeburg and began an orgy of looting, murder, and rape. Fires broke out, whether started by defenders to deny the enemy shelter, or by attackers in the chaos of combat, or simply by accident as soldiers ransacked houses with torches in hand. Nobody could say for certain. The fire spread with terrifying speed through the wooden structures of the medieval city. Within hours, Magdeburg was an inferno. Soldiers and civilians alike died in the flames. Those who fled the fire often ran into soldiers who cut them down. Women were raped before being murdered. Children were killed indiscriminately. The city burned for 3 days. When the smoke cleared, perhaps 5,000 people were alive out of the pre-siege population of 35,000. 90% of the city's buildings were destroyed. Tilly himself was reportedly horrified by what his army had done, but the soldiers had been unpaid and hungry, and when you create an army that feeds itself through plunder, you cannot easily control what happens when that army finally gets into a wealthy city. Protestant propaganda seized on the Magdeburg Massacre as proof of Catholic barbarity. Pamphlets circulated throughout Europe describing the atrocities in lurid detail. Gustavus Adolphus used the destruction to rally support, vowing vengeance for the martyred Protestants. The Catholic response was more defensive. Yes, terrible things happened, but in the chaos of war, who could say exactly what occurred? Besides, the city had rebelled against its lawful sovereign. What nobody wanted to acknowledge was that the atrocity transcended religious categories. The soldiers who committed those acts cared nothing for theology. They cared about plunder, about pay, about survival in a brutal war where the line between soldier and bandit had long since dissolved. But acknowledging that would mean admitting that this war was not what anyone had claimed it was. The Protestant triumphs. Galvanized by Magdeburg, Gustavus Adolphus unleashed his army across Germany. In September 1631, at Breitenfeld near Leipzig, the Swedish forces met the imperial army in open battle. The imperial forces advanced in their traditional formations, expecting to break the Swedish lines through sheer mass and firepower. Instead, the Swedish artillery tore holes in their ranks. The Swedish infantry, organized in smaller, more flexible units, maneuvered around the imperial positions. The Swedish cavalry charged at precisely the right moments. By the end of the day, Tilly's army was shattered. 7,000 imperial soldiers lay dead. The rest fled in disorder. Gustavus marched south, deeper into Catholic territory. City after city opened its gates rather than face siege. Protestant populations, suppressed for a decade, rose up to welcome their liberator. Catholic territories braced for revenge. Tilly, trying to stop the Swedish advance, was mortally wounded in combat in April 1632. He died as he had lived, a soldier to the end, murmuring prayers as his life bled out. With Tilly dead and the imperial cause in desperate straits, Emperor Ferdinand did what he had sworn he would never do. He begged Wallenstein to return. Wallenstein agreed, but he demanded total command with no interference from the emperor or anyone else. Ferdinand, desperate, agreed to terms that made Wallenstein essentially an independent warlord with imperial backing. death at Lutzen. In November 1632, Wallenstein's rebuilt army confronted the Swedish forces near Lutzen. It was late in the campaign season, fog shrouded the battlefield, and both sides knew this could be decisive. The battle raged for hours in confused, brutal fighting. Gustavus Adolphus, leading from the front as always, charged into the thick of combat with his cavalry. Somewhere in the fog and chaos, the Swedish king was separated from his bodyguards. Shots rang out. Gustavus fell from his horse, wounded. Imperial cavalrymen swarmed over him, shooting and stabbing until the famous general lay still. By the time his bodyguards fought their way to him, Gustavus Adolphus was dead, his body stripped of its armor and valuables by soldiers who didn't recognize the man they'd just killed. The Swedes, learning their king had fallen, fought with desperate fury. They drove Wallenstein's forces from the field, technically winning the battle, but they had lost their irreplaceable commander. That night, as Swedish soldiers searched for the battlefield by torchlight, they found their king's naked corpse among the common dead, identified only by his distinctive features. Protestant Europe mourned the Lion of the North as a martyr and hero. Catholic Europe gave thanks that God had removed their most dangerous enemy. The war ground on.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.